This is Elected, a podcast for women in and around politics and our active accomplices. I'm your host, Sarah Elder Chaminara, and today my guest is Zoe Knowles. In the spirit of reconciliation, it's important to me to share my personal commitment to learning the history of colonialism and the ongoing systemic violence and oppression against Indigenous peoples. The land where I live, work, and record from is the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, Métis Nation Region 3, and all people who make their homes in Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. So, hi, Zoe.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for having me on today.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk with you. So Zoe is, so you're a graduate of poli-sci and marketing from McGill, and then you went on to work in advertising, and then you jumped to public affairs with Sussex Strategy Group. And then during the pandemic, you went into government and you worked for Christine Elliott, who is on my list of people I'd love to meet and talk with, by the way, while she was deputy premier and a minister of health, which obviously in a COVID context is significant. Yes, no one can see this, but Zoe's nodding. And then you moved on to work with Steve Clark, who is still the Ontario's Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing. And you just recently announced that you're leaving government. You're actually done now. And what are you going to do next?
I'm moving to the UK.
Wow.
Yes. I'm from the Commonwealth, returning to England.
Yeah.
Moving to London at the end of August. That's going to be very exciting.
Oh, wow. That's lovely. And so I know that on Twitter, you describe you in your bio, you say that you're a recovering political staffer?
Yes,
or was it
political staffer?
And when I first stepped out of politics, I said retired. So retired, recovering. Yeah, it does take a while to detox out of that experience.
This podcast, I think, is proof of that, because any opportunity to talk about my experience in government and talk about Ontario politics, I jump at.
Well, I don't think that, I think that, maybe there are some political staffers who, once they leave, they're like, I'm never, they just don't touch it again. But for me, it's like politics isn't like a one-off thing. It's like a lifelong love.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, and obviously I'm still doing it and fully committed in a different way.
Yeah. And I grew up in a very political household. My mother was a political reporter in Montreal for 20 years. She, covered the 95 Quebec referendum. So I like to say that, I was really born into it. I came by my love of politics naturally.
Wow.
And so we're always talking about it around the dinner table. Of course, when you're working in government, there are certain things that you can't say around the dinner table. But yeah, I think that I had a fantastic experience in government, which I think, may come as a shock to folks, because the past 2 years have been incredibly challenging and incredibly stressful. You're working truly 24/7. You don't have evenings, weekends, or mornings. And you're at DEFCON 4 all the time, especially, moving from a public health crisis and managing that while at the Ministry of Health to a housing crisis in Minister Clark's office. But that said, you're working with some incredibly intelligent, talented, dedicated people. And the political staffers that I worked with are really bound by a sense of urgency and a sense of purpose in your work. And that's what really keeps you going. In fact, when I was recruited to the Ministry of Health by Heather Watt, who was Minister Elliott's chief of staff, she emailed me and saying, because of my experience working on housing and healthcare clients at Sussex, One of my hospital clients had actually referred me for this job, had actually recommended me to Heather. And so she reached out and said, I want you on my team. I said, yes, absolutely. And she said, whoa, hold on. You need to think about this because this is not a normal job. You will not have any free time. It's going to be incredibly stressful. But it's going to be some of the most fulfilling work you ever do in your career. So she said, really think about it because this is not a normal job. And I said, I thought about it. I'm absolutely in. This is just the best way for me to serve and put my skills to good use at a time when the province was just going through such unprecedented, once in a generation challenges. And that maxim of, this is going to be some of the hardest and yet most fulfilling work you ever do, I felt throughout my time in government, whether we were rolling out vaccines, or whether we were introducing legislation to increase the supply of housing at a time when we have a severe shortage of homes. So I think that has definitely made me, very excited to be able to talk about that experience and hopefully encourage some more women to get into politics.
Yes. I really, that's like a love language of mine, is obviously encouraging girls and women to consider politics as a career, not only like the job of being elected, but also on the bureaucracy side, and then also like campaigning and communications and everything that goes along with that. It's amazing that you jumped into health and then you switched over to housing, and you're absolutely right there. Like, I can't even imagine. So if someone doesn't know, like what's an average, well, I mean, that's maybe not the best question to ask, because like, what's an average day like as a political staffer when you were working at a time there was nothing, quote unquote normal.
Nothing average.
There's nothing average about it. But like, what would a general kind of day be like for someone who doesn't know what happens as like a director of communications for a minister?
Yeah. So as director of communications, I had built a fantastic team around me. And one of the most important parts of my day was checking in with them. So for example, at the 9 to 5, quote unquote, which I use very loosely because it's more of a 5 to 9, frankly.
Yeah.
The average day of a political staffer really depends on where you fall in the office. So for example, if you are on the issues management side, your day starts very early. When the legislature is on, an issues manager will start their day off with a 7 a.m. call with all of the other issues managers in government, or of ministries, and run through what are the top issues that each of them are dealing with, so that everybody has that 360-degree view of what other ministries are dealing with. In the mornings, I would always connect with my team with a conference call right off the bat, just a 15-minute check-in on, here are the priorities that I'm dealing with today, so that you all have visibility. What are the priorities that each of you are dealing with? How can I help? And this was also a great opportunity for me to make sure that, for example, a strategic communications advisor who mostly manages speech writing, developing news releases, dividing communications plans, that they have visibility into what the issues manager is doing. And the issues manager is more of the, very fast-paced, dealing with issues immediately as they come up, dealing with media stories as they come up. And similarly, making sure that our social media manager had visibility into what my communications advisor and issues manager were dealing with. Because I find that in particular during the pandemic, where 90% of staffers were working from home, it was really easy to work in silos and not have visibility into what other sides of the team were working on. And I think that maintaining that visibility within a team only serves to strengthen the team as a whole. So I would wake up at around 6 or 7 in the morning. I would run through some of the daily media clippings to see, what are the issues that I'll be dealing with that day.
I missed getting the clippings so much. It was I love it.
Me too. Me too. Yeah. You really develop an appreciation for it. I found it
it's like everything you want to know about anything, touching government. And it's like, it just arrives in your inbox. And for like someone who loves the news, I love the news. I really miss it.
It's just this wonderfully curated list of all the articles you need to read. It was great.
Yeah.
So, I would wake up at 6 or 7 a.m., start my day off by, in bed reading on my phone all of the daily clippings, go through Twitter, see what my minister had been tagged in. I would connect with my issues manager after their call, or rather my issues manager would connect with me to let me know if there are any pressing issues that I needed to be aware of from other ministries. Then at 9 a.m., I would have my daily call with my team. And that was also a good touch point for them to say, Zoe, I'll be sending you some products today at around noon. And if you can review it by tomorrow, that would be great. Or they may say, Zoe, we're working on a quick timeline for this one speech or this one news release. I'm going to send it to you around 10 or 11 a.m. If you can please get back to me with any edits you have by 1 or 2 p.m. that I can send that over, and continue through the review process. So that was a great way for them to make sure that throughout my incredibly busy, slammed day, that the products that I need to review, I'm reviewing on time and I'm not holding up the process. When the legislature is in session, there are morning question period prep calls where we make sure that the ministers are fully prepped. Those have moved back to in person, which is great. And that's also where, they can all kind of loosen up a little bit, have some fun with it, make sure that we're all, on the same page. And sometimes, particularly if you're the deputy premier, which Christine Elliott, she wasn't just the Minister of Health, she was also deputy premier, she needs to be on hand to respond to any question from any other ministry. So that's also a great opportunity for her to connect with those other ministers and to make sure that she's fully briefed on what those issues are.
She doesn't want to get a surprise.
Exactly.
And be caught off guard. She wants to know, right?
Exactly. But to be clear, Christine Elliott was never caught off guard.
Okay. I love it. There are different kinds of ministers. Let's be honest.
Yes.
Just like there are all kinds of different people. Some people do their homework and some people, to the best of their abilities. Yeah. And yes, exactly. So, there are all kinds. So she was the prepared one.
She was both Minister Elliott and Minister Clark were so incredibly prepared. We would always say in the office that they know these files at times better than their policy advisors do, who spend all day on these files. And so one of the most wonderful things about working with these two ministers is that you weren't just saying, these are the lines, stick to the lines. You would actually have conversations with them. And in particular with Minister Clark, who obviously I worked a lot closer with in my capacity as Director of Communications, but not only when it comes to prepping him for the legislature, but also prepping him for press conferences. He and I would have, very in-depth conversations about what is the best way to communicate this policy, which are at times incredibly complicated policies. And so that was a real treat for me. And it's funny, you can see the real difference in style between those two ministers in the legislature. Minister Elliott was always very cool, calm, and collected. And Minister Clark would always have so much fun in the ledge. And it was, as I said, it was just such a treat for me to be able to work with such best-in-class ministers who were truly leaders in a time of crisis.
Well, and I think that's a really common, so there's like obviously politicians like across the board have a very bad reputation with the public. And I had the opportunity to work with some really, really good people who really, really worked hard and with the best interests of British Columbians at heart. And I, when people talk, when I, hear someone saying like, all politicians are crooks, for example, which is like, so easy and lazy, to be honest. I push back because that's absolutely not true. There are people like, they don't understand, how hard it is to be in those jobs. First of all, the sacrifices that are involved. And then also, I think for the most part, everyone gets into politics because they want to make a difference. And that gets lost, the humanity of it and the determination to do things so that, you leave things better than when you left them.
I completely agree. In Canadian politics, you don't really get into it for the glory. You get into it because you love your community and you want to help it grow or you want to see it succeed. Yeah. For so many politicians, there's a specific personal cause that really pushes them to get into it. And that's something that really drives them throughout their career. That's certainly the case with the two ministers that I worked with. And that's also the case for a lot of the staffers. I got into it because I, had experience in healthcare and housing, and I was recruited to work for the Minister of Health during a global pandemic. And when I was promoted to Director of Communications to Minister Clark, housing is my passion. And that really, it keeps you going. It's your fuel as you're running on, 4 hours of sleep every night for a long time. And, just to quickly circle back to what the average day looks like, because it really can be quite an opaque job for a lot of people who haven't worked in government. When the legislature is in session, you're watching them. You have that on the background the whole time.
Did you have a little TV on your desk?
I did have a TV, but it was a very old TV. And so more often than not, I actually ended up getting a third screen, a third monitor, so that I could just have the Queen's Park video on the whole time. And you would constantly be listening in on that. And anytime you become very adept at picking up the voice of your minister and their name, because anytime you hear that, you just stop and you turn and you make sure that you're watching.
It's your spidey senses.
Exactly. And then when your minister, knocks one out of the park, you say, yes, great job. That was amazing. And it's so much fun to watch. And so, throughout the day, my days would often be filled with conference calls, be that with other ministries. For example, we're working on a multi-ministry file, or there's a particular issue or media story that may cover a couple of different ministries, or you're on calls with the Premier's office, working through the longer term strategy. And
especially in terms of COVID, the Premier's office, and then, so being the Minister of Health, but then also the Deputy Premier, that was a completely different, a more intense dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because on the communication side, obviously, it's the accountability ultimately. People want to know it's Doug Ford's government. What are you doing about this? But then, right. But then also it's the role, and each of those, it was interesting to see how, different premiers and different health ministers, along with their own chief medical officers, manage that relationship. And it was different in every province.
Yes, absolutely. And, the personality between Minister Elliott and Premier Ford, they're very different. And so they're able to kind of get at people in different emotional ways. At the beginning of the pandemic, for the first, I would say for the first year and a bit of the pandemic, I think that where Premier Ford was strongest was when he was going out doing his daily pressers, which is what we call press conferences, and saying, this is what I know, and I'm sharing that with you, the people of Ontario, so that you can make the decision that is right for you. and taking on a very, a real approach of transparency and honesty, because this was something brand new and nobody knew how long it was going to last. Nobody knew how many waves we were going to see. And you're really, as the saying goes, you're building the ship as you're riding it. There was so much learning on the job that you're inevitably going to make mistakes. And it's about recognizing those mistakes and learning from them and being honest with the people. We're just human. We're not perfect.
Well, and I think we're obviously dealing with the consequences of that, because the people are like, well, things have changed, and it's created mistrust in the system and in politicians and in COVID. I think because things haven't been predictable, or the science has changed, and that's because the science we're learning the science like still, and so people are, I think, generally are doing their best, and it's just such a difficult thing.
Yeah, and I think just have empathy for the people who are on the ground, the people who are making the policy, the people who are interpreting the policy. Of course, the average Ontarian who's just trying to keep themselves and their family and their community safe. Empathy is what really guided us, and maintaining that, very basic human connection with people. Obviously, I say that metaphorically. So, for example, there was one example that I'd like to share. At the beginning of the vaccine rollout, we obviously had very limited supplies, and we needed to distribute those supplies in a way that would have the most impact with the highest risk populations. And one of those populations were the northern and remote Indigenous populations. So to do that, to distribute these vaccines, we had a number of challenges that we had to overcome in partnership with Orange, which is our fantastic air ambulance service provider. The number one challenge was, of course, access. Some of these communities are only accessible by ice roads. And, those roads are becoming increasingly thin and dangerous. And so a lot of supplies can only be flown in by helicopter. The other, and I would say most significant challenge was there's a huge amount of distrust amongst these communities of government, which is completely founded because there's a history of medical experimentation and huge amounts of racism. And so what we did was we worked, of course, very closely with Orange and very closely with the local Indigenous elders and community leaders to involve them in the design and development of these programs, and really making sure that they had the space to develop these programs, develop the communications plans, and develop the vaccination plans in a way that acknowledges and recognizes the very legitimate fears and anxieties of their community, and acknowledges and recognizes the cultural, what makes their cultures so unique. And to be clear, there's about 31 of these communities. So they all have very unique cultures within them. One of the most effective tactics that we had was having the local Indigenous medicine practitioners right there with the health practitioners from Orange who were actually giving the vaccines, so that they could answer those questions. And leading up to the vaccines actually being brought to these communities, there were extensive Q&A sessions with that community to answer any and all questions they have. And to be clear, the Ministry of Health in Orange, we're not taking the leadership role there. This was a conversation between the Indigenous community leaders and their community. We were there to answer any questions about the vaccine, but really just to play that supporting role. And also, most importantly, one of the most effective ways that we were able to build that trust was to have some of the first vaccines be received by elders in the community to demonstrate that it's safe. And that was an incredibly successful campaign. We had 4 months to distribute first dose vaccines to the majority of these communities. We only needed 3. This was Homer Tien, who was at Orange, is just an absolute rock star and just the best in his field at this. So that's an example that I'm particularly proud of, because it really demonstrates the importance of empathy and providing that space for local leaders to co-design and co-develop the programs that you're going to be using for their community.
Well, I think that's the best way to achieve them or have the most success in so many different ways. But, in your example, but generally as well, when you can educate and create that community buy-in, you will have better outcomes.
Absolutely. And, it's so critical to have folks from different backgrounds and different experiences to deliver effective, comprehensive communications and give our government a more complete toolkit to govern such a diverse population.
Which also, on the diversity in, on the elected side is also really critical, because you have different people at the table who have different experiences, who speak different languages, who have different backgrounds, who can, provide different kinds of input into decision making, and you get better decisions and, have more thoughtful conversations.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think I've interrupted your day. I asked that question, and it's like stopped and started 3 times. So do you want to, I'll let you finish and I will not interrupt you.
So part 3. So, you start your day off pretty early. You're in a series of conference calls for most of the day. And then you're, in the few minutes you have in between conference calls, you're answering as many emails as you can. You're reviewing as many products as you can. And your whole day is a system of triage. I will be constantly scrolling through on my phone, my inbox, to see what are the, urgent media inquiries that I need to answer right now. What are the products, the communications products that I can review, later tonight once I get home? And what can wait until tomorrow, or what can I delegate to my team? And you're constantly going through that over the course of the day. Over the course of the day, I would receive texts and calls from reporters, especially if there's a breaking story. They'll say, can I get a comment from the minister? Can I get a comment from you? Can we just chat off the record so I can get some background information on this particular issue? The day only starts to slow down at around 8 p.m.
Oh, only 8 p.m.
Only 8 p.m. Yeah. Sometimes it's much later, but the day starts to slow down around then. So I always would make a point to walk to and from work. I'd be answering emails or on conference calls the whole time, but it was the only physical activity I was able to squeeze into my day.
I used to do the same thing.
It's just a great way to get yourself ready for the day, and then get yourself ready for going home and trying to spend some time with your family. And then you start it all over again the next day.
Yeah. Yeah. And you never turn off, do you?
You never turn off. I think I took 3 days off over the course of 2 years. And two of those days was to get engaged.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. That was an important, and it was funny. I remember telling my chief, I said, I just have to take this one weekend off. We've been trying to get engaged for this entire pandemic. my poor fiance had planned all of these different events that had all gotten COVID canceled right at the last second. I said, we just have to get it done, so to speak.
That's lovely. Are you planning the wedding now then?
We are, yeah, we're planning the wedding now.
Oh, well,
So
that's exciting.
I can put all of my, communications manager
Yes.
skills into that.
Yes, you totally can. You totally can. Planning a wedding is a lot like, well, I mean, if you have any background in event planning through government, it serves you well when it comes to planning a wedding.
Yeah, I've got the best Rolodex in the biz to find all the best photographers, and
your sound will be amazing. Oh, that's so great. Oh, and like also like so nerdy.
Speaking to the diversity of this government, from a housing perspective, that was also very important for us. This is I would say a very diverse party, and so many of our MPPs, they come from multi-generational households, and so many of them are first or second generation Canadians who have seen how important it is to be able to have a home that fits your entire family, because having a home is the primary way that families create wealth. And one of our big focal points, when I was director of communications for our housing minister, and a big focus for us moving forward is, how do we create government does not build homes. What we create is a facilitating regulatory environment in which homes can be built faster and less expensively for the home buyer. And that also includes, how can we enable more missing middle housing so that, you can build, so that if you're a senior and your health needs are evolving, you can downsize into a home that better suits your needs, but you don't have to move outside of your community. If you are, in your 50s or 60s and you have kids who are in their 20s and 30s and they're having maybe a tough time finding a home, how can we make it easier for you to build an additional residential unit on your property so that your kids can, buy their first home, but also have some measure of independence? Or even, how can you build an additional residential unit and then put it onto the rental market? So that, home ownership is not the only way that you can have a home. Being able to find rental housing that meets your needs is incredibly important. And, you're coming from BC. It's, as it's very difficult to find rental properties that
and very expensive.
4 or 5 bedrooms, very expensive, but you cannot find a 4 or 5 bedroom rental property.
No.
And so for so many families, their only recourse is to buy a home, and it's very, very expensive.
Well, and it's also, because of the governments of, at different levels have put in different mechanisms to kind of, help or hopefully cool the market in some ways. But, even if you think about, so multi-generational families, it would be maybe a set of parents, they have a couple of kids, and then maybe, it's their parents and maybe like an aunt or uncle, but then also thinking about, Canada's role in, in accepting Afghan and Ukrainian refugees. They also have families of different sizes, or even a family that maybe has lived in downtown Toronto or Scarborough or wherever, and they have 3 children, and they can't live in a 1-bedroom apartment or a studio, and developers really like building 1-bedroom apartments. And so incentively, the 2-bedroom and 3-bedroom apartments, never mind 4 is like a penthouse, right?
Yeah.
Getting them to build different kinds of housing in different places that's accessible to transit, schools, government has a role to play.
Oh, absolutely. And, I think it's I personally, I do think that developers just get a bad rap because they're, you know, developers, unless you're a nonprofit, they're not a charity. Of course, they're looking to make a profit. The challenge that we run into is that when it's so expensive to build, let's say a 10-story apartment building, which in Toronto would be fairly low.
Yes.
We're now seeing some super tall apartment buildings. When it's so expensive, you as a developer are going to have to find as many efficiencies as you possibly can. And what that often means is that you need to have identical floor plans, or not identical, but as similar as you possibly can, so that you can find those efficiencies. And one of the big reasons for this is because the timeline to recoup your costs, the return on your investment, is 10 to 15 years. And as we've seen, especially in the past year, they're also having to cover for inflationary increases on the cost of supplies and construction supplies, labor. And so where government has a role to play is in making it easier for developers to build the full spectrum of housing options. That means providing incentives to purpose-built rentals, for example, by exempting or deferring development charges. That means creating incentives to build missing middle housing, for example, by exempting or deferring development charges on those properties, which is exactly what the City of Toronto actually just passed a motion to exempt multiplexes with 4 or less units from development charges, which makes small-scale development significantly more cost-effective to build. And that also means creating a much more facilitating regulatory environment for below market housing, for example, co-op housing and community housing. With our Homes for Everyone bill that we passed just before the election, we introduced a community housing regulatory framework that resolves a lot of the issues that we had heard from community housing providers. And so, for example, it increases the range of options that community housing providers are able to offer to Ontarians who are on those wait lists to best meet their needs, while also enabling them to prioritize wait lists based on the level of need. So they're able to work through those wait lists a lot faster. And it provides a lot more financial security for these providers who, at the end of their contract, may say, you know what, it's no longer financially viable for me to be in community housing. I'm just going to sell this to a private developer, and then you lose those units. So government has a real role to play. And it's not always, the sexy stuff like we're going to provide $1 billion to build more housing. That's
end homelessness in 5 years.
End homelessness. Yeah, exactly. I mean, those are great headlines, but very difficult to implement if any steps to implement it are ever even taken.
Yeah.
Another really, really important thing that municipal governments need to take a lot more action on, but I'm very pleased to say that we are seeing a lot of municipalities in Ontario start to take action on this, is ending exclusionary zoning. Exclusionary zoning refers to the highly prescriptive zoning framework whereby in entire neighborhoods, the only type of house that you can build is a single family house. That could be a McMansion. That could be, a three-story house, 5,000 square feet for 2 or 3 people. But if you wanted to build a duplex or a triplex, or, divide the lot and build, 2 little townhouses there, that would cost you tens of thousands of dollars in zoning bylaw amendment fees to the municipality. That would require years of public consultation. And it often is just cost prohibitive for a developer to actually pursue this.
Well, it
Because
brings
again,
out all the NIMBYs, right? The not in my backyard people.
exactly. It brings out all the NIMBYs. And, Toronto in particular is one of the fastest growing cities in North America. And there's a reason for that. It's because it's a fantastic city. It's a fantastic labor market. But if there's no place for young people to live, then they're going to move elsewhere.
Like to Calgary.
Like to Calgary. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Or to Montreal. I mean, while I will praise Toronto City Council for exempting multiplexes from development charges, at the same time, Toronto has also decided to increase development charges on other forms of development by 46%, which will add tens of thousands of dollars to housing units, which, let's be clear, these costs are not borne by the developer. These costs are passed on to the home buyer. A developer is not saying, you know what, I'm going to be the angel here and just soak up all of these costs. No. They're here to make a profit. Let's be quite clear. These aren't charities. And, Toronto City Council will say, oh, our development charges are based on the principle that, that growth pays for growth, and Toronto development charges are, much lower than surrounding municipalities. Well, first of all, according to CMHC, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, Toronto development charges are about $86 per square foot compared to $70 in Vancouver and $24 in Montreal. And frankly, the principle that growth pays for growth places the onus of communal infrastructure on newcomers and prioritizes and indeed subsidizes established homeowners, making it that much more difficult for first-time homebuyers to break into a market.
This is such a big topic, and your passion for it is like very clear, and I love it. Your recovery. I'm gonna pretend to be a doctor of retired political staffers. My prescription for you is that your recovery is going to take a very long time.
I don't think I'll ever.
Yeah, you're never. It's not. It's actually. Yeah, you're right. It's never going to happen.
So, for example, there's a lot of opportunity for government to make it a lot easier to build the kind of missing middle housing and multi-generational housing that we need. And by missing middle, we mean, pretty much anything lower than 5 stories. So that's duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, townhomes. There's a couple of ways to do that. For example, instead of subscribing to the principle of growth pays for growth, you can tie buyer fees to actual infrastructure impacts to make sure that it's a bit more equitable. You can also mandate greater transparency on how development charges are actually being used and limit how fast development charges can grow. According to a fall 2021 report, the City of Toronto has $2.6 billion in development charges sitting in reserve. Now they're saying, well, they're sitting in reserve because it takes a long time for us to actually put them to use. Well, then maybe we should be finding ways to enable cities to make better use of them, to make better use of the funding that they have right now, rather than increasing costs that will be disproportionately felt by first-time homebuyers.
I'm sorry. They're saying they can't spend the money fast enough.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. That's, for anyone listening, that's absurd.
Yeah. And then, so then why are you mandating to increase these fees substantially if you can't make the best use of what you already have?
Yeah, that's an issue. I also want to invite you to come to Calgary because the development landscape in Calgary is so different than in Toronto, obviously 2 very different cities with, and the issue that we have is the city keeps growing. So like the sprawl is really something to see.
Mhm.
And new communities keep getting approved on, making it a multi-issue file. We have an ambulance shortage, for example.
Mm.
Firefighters are under-resourced, so they can't actually get to where something might be.
Yeah, and the cost of servicing these communities is incredibly high. I mean, I'm someone who is the biggest proponent of intensification and transit-oriented communities that you will ever see. And at the same time, when it's so difficult to build dense communities and to build more housing, and not just single family housing, I think we need to take a hard look at how we can incentivize not only the speed of development among municipalities, but also prioritize or incentivize a wider range of types of housing so that you're not just seeing single family. If people are not able to find a home in downtown Toronto, then the only way, if you can't move up, then you have to move out. And what really frustrated me in particular during the election, and I would have this debate with my parents all the time, actually, is that, it's really easy to say, well, we shouldn't be building highways. But if you can't live downtown, but your job is downtown, then you have to find a way to get there. And so you're talking out of both sides of your mouth if you're saying, well, we need to preserve the community character of these, lovely leafy neighborhoods, which are beautiful, but you can't say that you need to preserve that character. And at the same time that you can't build highways to create communities and create sprawl. It's I wouldn't say it's one or the other, but
yeah, it's definitely coming from a place of privilege, right? Because, chances are, the people in those leafy neighborhoods aren't making minimum wage.
No,
they're very likely to be more recently arrived in Canada. They probably have jobs that are blue collar, that are not 9 to 5. They have different needs. It is a different, you can't approach it in the same way.
No.
So, and there's
also-
such hypocrisy on the, from people who are like, I believe in climate change, right? But I'm not in favor of missing middle housing.
Yeah.
I'm not in favor of density. But so something has to give in that paradigm. And it's holding us back.
Yeah. And, Sarah, when you talk to people, I can't tell you how many community consultations I've been to about, about a particular development project. When you actually talk to them about what their issue is with this development, their issue is always, well, it's going to create shade on my property for a few days out of the year, because you do shadow studies, you can tell exactly how much shade there's going to be. Oh, well, it's going to create traffic. It's going to create
increase crime.
It creates crime. And the biggest justification that established entrenched homeowners will say is it's going to create a precedent for a developer to come in and build a 40-story building. So they'll say that this, duplex or a 4-story building will set a precedent for 40 stories. And what I will get blue in the face trying to explain is that those 40-story towers are being built because the 4-story building cannot be built. And actually, you will make better use of green space if you have denser living. Their chances are will be less traffic because more people will be able to use public transit. And these neighborhoods where you're seeing declining populations, where frankly, they don't have enough kids to go to their local school, that entire neighborhood will be revitalized because you're able to bring all of these new young families in.
Mhm.
That's how communities survive and thrive. And
Yeah,
if
I
you
live
want
in
to
an
preserve it, then they'll die.
I live in an older neighborhood in Calgary, and most of our neighbors are elderly people, and slowly, um, because of zoning changes, there are more families like mine. I have a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old, and the feedback that I've been given by some neighbors is like, it's so nice to see you here because like you're the future of the community, not only in terms of schools, but it's, they like seeing my kids out on the street.
Yeah.
And all these different things. So it's a converse. So much of it is based on
It's fear of change.
fear of change. Yeah, it is fear of change. Yeah.
Fear of change. But you know what? These are fast growing cities.
Yeah.
And change is the name of the game when you're living there.
Well, and
I
also,
have so much sympathy for someone who, they will buy a house. When somebody buys a house, they're not buying it thinking, oh, I'm so excited for this neighborhood to change completely in 20 years. Right. I have absolute sympathy for that. But to be clear, these neighborhoods, these communities, they will die if they are not adapting. If you are not, it isn't the houses and the regulations that make a community. It's the people that live there.
yeah, it does. You're absolutely right. And maybe this is a good place to close. I've kept you way longer than I told you I would. But I've had such a lovely time chatting with you. And these are obviously your experiences. And then your work in health and housing in Ontario is just so fascinating. And also since we're actually still in a pandemic, we haven't really gotten to a place yet where we've been able to reflect on maybe like some of those experiences, like the ones that you've had, or, there's the mental health aspect of, hopefully when COVID ends, which I think we all want it to be done and over. But it's super fascinating to talk with you. And I wish you all the best with your future in the UK and then in London. It's maybe you'll come back to politics at some point.
Maybe. Never say never. One thing that I'll say just before we close out is I would just like to give a shout out in particular to all of the fantastic women that I worked with at the Ministry of Health. What also made that a unique experience is that the vast majority of leadership in that office was women. Of course, the minister is a woman. The chief of staff, Heather Watt, is a mother of 3. She had, I think, 2 kids over the course of the pandemic.
Wow. In addition to being chief of staff?
Yes, I have no idea how she did it. And then all of the directors, save for one, were also women. And it was just such a wonderful, it was an extremely positive experience at an extremely stressful time. And it made me a lot more confident going into that, again, incredibly stressful atmosphere. And it made me more confident, pursuing senior leadership myself, being able to have such fantastic role models within that office. So I would just like to give all of them a quick shout out because they're, truly the best in the biz. And, Sarah, I think the key to getting more women in politics is seeing them there.
Uh-huh.
I think that the Ford government is doing a very good job of creating that space for people who are intelligent and enthusiastic to come into politics. And as we've said so many times on this podcast, having a diversity of backgrounds and experiences is really the only way that you can develop effective, comprehensive, and complete communications and policy that works for the incredibly diverse population that we have.
Yeah. things have changed. Things are changing. Things will continue to change, whether people like it or not. It's about bringing them along for the ride, about getting their buy-in, even if it's reluctantly. But it's so necessary. Like the world is no longer where it was even 2 years ago. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. It's lovely to meet you. I hope one day we meet in person, actually.
Absolutely.
If I'm ever in London, we can, do you like gin and tonics?
Oh, well, you have to if you're going to be a Londoner.
Right? Okay. Well, one day, hopefully we can meet for a gin and tonic and continue this conversation.
Absolutely. And there'll be no timeline to the conversation.
Right?
So yes. For many hours.
Exactly. Yes. So thank you so much, Zoe.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.